The sky above Europe in the early years of the Second World War carried more than the roar of engines and the distant thud of explosions. It carried something else, something harder to describe. A kind of tension that clung to the air like a living thing. Smoke coiled above burning cities. Searchlights scanned the clouds for incoming bombers. Families huddled in shelters, unsure whether dawn would arrive for them. And high above that fragile world flew the men of fighter command. Some were barely out of their teenage years. Others had come from colonies, farms, factories, universities. They carried with them fear, courage, and the weight of a nation struggling to stay alive. Among them, one pilot stood apart. Not because he looked heroic. Not because he wore medals or carried a reputation forged over years of frontline combat. He stood apart because his body had been broken in a way most people never return from. Both his legs had been taken from him almost a decade earlier in a violent crash. But now, as the engines of his Spitfire warmed on the airfield, he prepared to rise into the storm once again. He checked the harness, adjusted the rudder pedals with the precision of a man whose life depended on every exact movement. Outside his cockpit canopy, ground crews moved with practiced haste. This man who should not have been able to run, climb, or even walk without pain was about to lead young pilots into battle against an enemy larger, stronger, and better prepared. His name was Douglas Bader, and his story was not simply about a pilot who flew without legs. It was about a man who refused to let fate dictate the limits of his existence. A man who took a broken future and rebuilt it into something larger than life. This is the story of how a boy shaped by empire became one of the most iconic figures in aviation. How a catastrophic accident that could have destroyed him instead ignited a new fire within. How he fought not only enemy aircraft but also the shadow of despair. This is the story of what a human being becomes when every door is closed, except the ones they pry open themselves. This is the story of Douglas Bader. Long before he became a symbol of determination, Douglas Robert Stoyard Bader was simply a child searching for his place in a world shaped by shifting borders and traditions. Born in 1910, he belonged to a generation caught between the ambitions of an empire and the storm clouds of a changing century. His father, an officer in the British Army, died when Douglas was still young. The loss cast a quiet shadow across his childhood, but it also shaped his sense of duty. He grew up hearing stories of courage and sacrifice from veterans who had survived the Great War. Their words fed his imagination and planted in him the belief that courage was not an ornament but a responsibility. At school he displayed both brilliance and impatience. He excelled at sports not because he loved competition for its own sake, but because speed and motion seemed to speak to him more clearly than books or conversation. Running across a playing field made him feel connected to something larger. It was as if movement itself could answer questions he did not yet know how to ask. His rebellious streak caused friction. Teachers saw a boy full of potential but lacking restraint. He was quick to challenge rules that seemed pointless and refused to accept the idea that caution should guide every decision. His temper was sharp, but so was his sense of loyalty. Friends remembered him as someone who could be brash, but also fiercely protective. By the age of 18, he had developed a fascination with machines that danced with the wind. Aircraft were still evolving in those years between the wars. Pilots spoke of flying with a kind of reverence. For Bader, the sky offered something nothing on the ground could match. It offered freedom, speed, and the chance to measure himself against a challenge that remained untouched by human hands. He applied to the Royal Air Force College at Cranwell with the same confidence that had both impressed and irritated his instructors throughout his youth. At Cranwell, he found the environment that seemed designed for him. Here were young men who shared his hunger for adventure, his delight in flight, and his belief that service required boldness. Flying training came naturally to him. Instructors noted his quick reflexes and intuitive control, but they also expressed concern about his aggressive nature in the cockpit. He loved low passes, sharp turns, and daring maneuvers that pushed the aircraft to its limits. He chased perfection even when doing so bordered on dangerous. Still, his skill could not be denied. When he earned his place in the Royal Air Force, he believed that his path was set. A life of flying, of testing the boundaries of what was possible, lay ahead of him. The sky would be his home. He had no idea how violently that home would be taken from him. In 1931, Bader was assigned to a squadron known for spirited flying. The culture around him encouraged competition, daring, and displays of confidence. It was the sort of environment where young pilots felt invincible, wrapped in the pride of belonging to a service that saw itself as the guardian of the Empire's skies. During preparations for an air display, Bader volunteered to participate in aerobatic practice. He loved the thrill of it. Loved how the world inverted during a loop or how the wings cut through the air in a tight turn. He believed that skill should be demonstrated, not just spoken of. That day he pushed too far. While practicing a maneuver at low altitude, he attempted a roll that was never meant to be executed so close to the ground. The aircraft dipped. The wingtip struck the surface, and in a fraction of a second the world exploded around him. The crash shattered the plane and everything inside it. Rescue teams arrived to find a wreckage that looked impossible to survive. They'd pulled him out still clinging to life, but the injuries were devastating. His legs were torn apart by the impact, bones splintered beyond what surgeons could repair. In the hospital, doctors fought to control the bleeding. Infection threatened to overwhelm his body. The decision came with grim certainty. To save his life, they had to amputate both legs. One above the knee, the other below. When Bader regained consciousness, he entered a reality that felt colder and more disorienting than the crash itself. The man who had defined himself through physical power and speed now lay still, trapped in a broken body. Nurses moved quietly around him. Visitors whispered condolences. He stared at the ceiling and felt the world narrowing around him. The Royal Air Force discharged him with sympathy, but no room for negotiation. The message was simple. His flying days were over. His future would be spent in recovery, not in cockpits. For a man whose identity had been tied to motion, the loss was unbearable. But beneath that grief, something darker and more powerful began to take shape. He realized he could accept the end of the life he dreamed of, or he could fight against the world that believed he was finished. Only one of those choices felt possible to him. For a double amputee in the early 1930s, rehabilitation wasn't just difficult, it was punishing. Prosthetic technology back then lacked the refinement modern patients rely on. Artificial legs were heavy, stiff, and unforgiving. The straps dug into the skin, causing constant chafing. Balance required endless, frustrating practice, and even the smallest movements were accompanied by a sharp, grinding pain. Doctors advised patience. Nurses offered gentle encouragement. But Douglas Bader didn't see his recovery as a medical process. He saw it as a challenge, a fight he had no intention of losing. He practiced walking until the stumps of his legs were bruised and raw. He forced himself through grueling exercises long after exhaustion should have made him stop. Physical pain simply mattered less to him than the threat of a life lived with diminished expectations. He refused pity. He absolutely refused to be treated as fragile or broken. When well-meaning visitors expressed sympathy, he met their words with a cold, steely defiance. He wasn't just rebuilding his body to walk again. He was rebuilding it to reclaim the life he believed had been stolen from him. Over time, through sheer force of will, he learned to move with surprising ease. He even began modifying his own artificial legs, trimming material here, adjusting angles there, experimenting with any change that might give him a slight edge. Where others saw limitations, Bader saw engineering problems that needed to be solved. Months turned into years. And though he was officially retired from the Royal Air Force, the desire to fly again burned hotter than ever. He was fully aware that the Air Force considered him a liability. He knew that many people, including those who cared about him, believed he was simply refusing to accept the harsh reality of his situation. But he had proved people wrong before, and he was determined to do it again. He started his own unofficial training regimen. He practiced stepping into the cockpits of grounded aircraft, timing himself, refining the motion. He tested how his artificial feet interacted with the rudder pedals, pushing and adjusting, teaching his body new muscle memory. He forced his legs to respond quickly enough to manage the complex dance of takeoffs and landings. Every small success, every tiny improvement, brought him one step closer to his ultimate goal. Eventually, he petitioned the Royal Air Force for a full medical review. His relentless determination impressed some and completely puzzled others. But after a series of intense physical and psychological tests, and a lot of heated debate among senior officers, the impossible happened. He was granted permission to fly again. When he climbed into the cockpit for the first time since the crash, he did so as a man reborn through struggle and fire. The engine roared to life. The aircraft lifted smoothly into the air. The controls responded to his touch as if they were an extension of his own body. The sky, his old friend, opened up in front of him. And for the first time in years, Douglas Bader felt whole. But history had plans for him that would take him far beyond personal recovery. The world was marching toward war. And Douglas Bader would not be a spectator. He would be a warrior. In 1939, the uneasy peace that had held Europe together for 2 decades finally collapsed. Germany invaded Poland, and war erupted with a force that shook the entire continent. Britain mobilized rapidly, scrambling to prepare for a conflict many had feared was inevitable. Experienced pilots were urgently needed. And Bader, newly reinstated, was placed right back into the ranks of fighting men. His return did not go unnoticed. Some welcomed him with open admiration for his grit. Others, however, questioned whether a man with 2 artificial legs truly belonged in the cockpit of a high-performance fighter. But doubt only ever sharpened Bader's drive. He threw himself into the work with an unmatched intensity. He began training younger, less experienced pilots, passing on the knowledge he had formed from both exceptional skill and hard-won lessons. His training methods were famously strict. His expectations were sky-high. But his belief in iron discipline stemmed from a simple, brutal truth. In air combat, mistakes weren't measured in reprimands, but in lost lives. His very presence inspired those around him. They saw a man who had walked through the fire of personal tragedy and emerged with a will stronger than steel. His defiance in the face of his own limitations became a rallying point for others in an era darkened by growing uncertainty. His aircraft of choice became the legendary Hawker Hurricane and, later, the Supermarine Spitfire. These machines weren't just tools of war for him. They were extensions of a pilot's spirit. In Bader's hands, they became powerful symbols of his absolute refusal to be diminished by injury or by doubt. As German bombers prepared to strike British cities, the stage was set for one of the most critical air campaigns in history, the Battle of Britain. And Douglas Bader, never one to stand aside, stepped directly into the center of the fight. The summer of 1940 brought with it a desperate struggle that would decide the fate of the British Isles. The German Luftwaffe launched a massive, relentless air assault aimed at destroying the Royal Air Force and clearing the way for a full-scale invasion. Against this overwhelming threat stood a dangerously limited number of pilots. Many were barely out of training, and all of them were exhausted from the constant readiness and the never-ending sorties. Day after day, they rose to meet wave after wave of enemy aircraft. The skies over southern England became a chaotic, 3-dimensional battlefield where survival was measured in seconds. Bader quickly emerged as a leading figure in this struggle. He was a natural combat leader. He pushed himself, his aircraft, and his squadron to the absolute edge of their capabilities. He favored aggressive, head-on tactics, believing that decisive, violent action could disrupt enemy formations and break their morale before they ever reached their targets. In combat, he moved with a cold, calculated precision. He trusted his instincts completely and had no hesitation in engaging enemy fighters at dangerously close range. This fearsome confidence spread to the pilots who flew under his command. They followed him into the thick of the fighting because they believed he understood the stakes better than anyone. His victories began to mount. He wasn't seeking personal glory. He fought with a unique clarity of purpose, born from the intimate knowledge that life could be taken away in an instant. He knew what it meant to lose everything. And he refused to lose his nation. Even the German pilots, his adversaries, came to regard him with a grudging respect. Newspapers at home reported his achievements with breathless admiration. But behind the public image of the legless ace was a man driven by something deeper and more personal than just patriotism. He fought because flying was his life, his very identity, and he would not allow anyone or anything to take it from him again. But even legends cannot escape the risks of war forever. In 1941, during a mission over occupied territory, Douglas Bader's luck finally reached its limit. His aircraft was hit during a dogfight, forcing him into a desperate attempt to escape. As he tried to bail out, one of his artificial legs became trapped in the cockpit. For a moment, he faced the terrifying possibility of dying inside the falling aircraft. But with remarkable presence of mind, he tore himself free from the prosthetic and deployed his parachute just in time, watching his plane smash into the ground below. Captured by German forces upon landing, he became a truly unusual prisoner of war. His reputation as the legless ace had preceded him. The German officers who interrogated him treated him with an odd mixture of respect and caution. They recognized the sheer determination that had made him such a formidable opponent in the skies. But Bader had absolutely no intention of cooperating. From the moment he arrived at the POW camp, he began plotting his escape. He meticulously studied guard patterns, tested the boundaries of the camp, and constantly looked for weaknesses in its defenses. He wasn't just a prisoner. He was a problem waiting to happen. It didn't take long for him to put his plans into action. He escaped once and was recaptured. Undeterred, he tried again. And again. His relentless refusal to remain captive frustrated his captors so deeply that they eventually transferred him to the infamous Colditz Castle, a high-security fortress prison reserved for the most troublesome and persistent Allied prisoners. They thought its imposing walls and strict security would finally break his spirit. They were wrong. Even behind the stone walls of Colditz, Bader remained defiant. He became a living symbol of resistance for his fellow prisoners. His very presence gave them strength and hope. His continuous escape attempts, though ultimately unsuccessful in that fortress, reminded everyone that captivity did not have to mean surrender. It was a powerful message. The body may be imprisoned, but the mind can remain free. Bader remained at Colditz until the final stages of the war, when Allied forces finally liberated the prisoners. He walked out of that fortress not as a broken man, but as someone who had challenged fate and in his own way had won. When the war ended, Douglas Bader returned to Britain as a national hero. His story was everywhere. But he never allowed the larger-than-life image projected onto him by the newspapers to define who he was. He knew his own story was far more complicated than heroic headlines. He held strong opinions, some of which were controversial. He was not a flawless man, and he never pretended to be. Yet his legacy endured because it was anchored in something much deeper than personality. It was anchored in sheer, unyielding resilience. He spent his post-war years advocating tirelessly for disabled veterans, using his own experience to fight for their rights and well-being. He returned to the world of aviation, lending his expertise to industries that were shaping the future of flight. He also spoke publicly about overcoming hardship, but always with a powerful emphasis on personal responsibility. He truly believed that limits were often things we choose for ourselves, not things that are imposed upon us. He was living proof that determination could reshape the entire path of a life. The world might deal out unfair, tragic events, but individuals still held the power to choose how they would respond. Generations of new pilots looked to his story for inspiration. Historians noted his incredible impact on morale during Britain's darkest hours of the war. And the veterans who met him often spoke of his direct, uncompromising, and sometimes abrasive presence. He was not a man who sugar-coated reality. But above all, his legacy offered a timeless reminder. Defeat is not measured by physical injury. Courage is not the absence of fear, but acting in spite of it. And the human will, when sharpened by a clear purpose, can rise above circumstances that should have ended a life. The life of Douglas Bader was shaped by extremes. Extreme tragedy, extreme effort, and extreme courage. He flew into battle without legs, but with a spirit that seemed impossible to contain. He made mistakes. He pushed boundaries. He challenged authority at every turn. But he also proved that a person can fall further than they ever imagined and still rise to meet the world entirely on their own terms. His name remains etched in the long and celebrated history of aviation, not just because of the victories he achieved in the sky, but because of the incredible odds he overcame on the ground. The young boy who dreamed of flight became the man who refused to surrender it, no matter what. In every cockpit he entered and every sky he crossed, there was a single powerful truth woven through his entire journey: a body may fail. Fate may strike without any warning. But the will to rise again can carry a person farther than any aircraft ever could. This is why the story of Douglas Bader is still told today. Not as a tale of perfection, but as a raw testament to the strength found in defiance. It's a reminder that the human spirit, even when it's broken, can still learn to fly. Thank you for watching. If this story moved you, please consider liking this video and subscribing for more.